Hello, History 363. So when we left off at our last video, we were talking about this endemic social and economic and political inequality that exists in early Rome. There have been some attempts to ameliorate it, whether it's through the publication of a law code, whether it's through some changes to the executive of the Roman state, for the most part electing consular tribunes rather than consuls. But for the most part, the fundamental social and economic inequality is still there, as well as this artificial but very real divide between patricians and plebeians. Starting in 406, the Romans undertake a major military operation against a rival city-state, and that is the city-state of Veii. And from the perspective of subsequent Roman conquests, this is a very modest operation. Veii is about 12 miles from Rome, which means you can start out early in the morning, and after a brisk march, you can be in Veii probably by lunchtime. Veii is an Etruscan city. Supposedly, the Romans say that the conquest of Veii takes them 10 years, from 406 to 396. I actually think we should be a little suspicious about this nice round number. It corresponds precisely with the 10 years of the Trojan War. But I'm basically willing to accept that the capture of Veii, the conquest of Veii, took multiple campaigns. It led to a very important reform for the nature of Rome's army, and actually the nature of the Roman state at large, in that for the first time, the Romans start paying soldiers to fight. Before, if you fought in the Roman army, you might have gotten a share of loot if you were lucky enough to raid an enemy and steal some sheep or goats or whatever. But now the Romans, in order to actually engage in conquest, say we will pay the soldiers who are fighting to besiege Veii. And so this military pay called stipendium, which of course leads to an army that you keep in the field longer. If people are getting paid, they can stay away from their farms longer. Also, there was a corollary. If you're going to start paying the troops, you need to find the money. And therefore, the Romans institute a war tax called Tributum in order to fund the stipendium, the military pay. And this is actually a major step in the Roman state developing a fiscal apparatus that can fund more intensive warfare than just raiding sheep from your neighbors. Now, finally, in 396, the Romans capture Veii, and they annex its entire territory. And this is actually a really critical moment. It's really a turning point in the struggle between patricians and plebeians and with the problems of just fundamental inequalities in Roman society. Because it's very hard in any society. We discover this in our own troubles today. It's hard to redistribute wealth in a society. The people with the wealth will fight tooth and nail to prevent redistribution, and they tend to control the levers of power. One advantage of conquest, though, is you can conquer your way out of your own socioeconomic problems. People who will fight tooth and nail to prevent their land from being redistributed may be willing to redistribute land that's captured from somebody else, and that's ultimately what happens. The Romans capture Veii, they double the size of the Ager Romanus, of Roman territory, and after a few years, they agree to start to distributing that land to either poor plebeians or to the sons of Romans who currently have enough land to be assidui, men capable of serving in the Roman army, because they meet the property qualification, but are worried that their sons will not be if that land is divided between multiple sons. But if you give one of those sons a chunk of land in Veii, now they can have a plot of land, and you actually have more people who can serve as soldiers. So the granting of captured land in Veii seems to go, it doesn't solve all of Rome's problems, but it does ameliorate some of the deeper issues of land hunger that had driven the plebs. It may also create new problems. This has been argued by a historian up at Toronto named Seth Bernard, in that it does seem that a lot of people are getting land in Veii, but they need startup money. And so around the time so they're borrowing money, and therefore you have a lot of people who are debtors as they go to basically pioneer this land that the Romans have captured. And we actually see fewer notices of famine problems after the capture of Veii because they now have much more agricultural land that can grow more food and feed more Romans. But debt actually becomes a problem. A lot of people have borrowed a lot of money. Some of them are going to be fine, but one bad crop, one hailstorm, one frigid night, and some farmers are going to bust out and now they're in debt. It seems, this may have existed before, but it becomes prominent, a particular type of debt contract called nexum, N-E-X-U-M, where you borrow money without necessarily having collateral or even the means to repay it. And the collateral is basically you, that you promise if you don't come up with money to repay the loan, or maybe even as the repayment itself, that you will work as an indentured servant to the person who loans you the money. And these nexum contracts seem to be quite onerous in the 4th century BC. And so on one hand, the capture of Veii it does seem to actually improve the socioeconomic problems, but it also creates some new problems, in particular, a lot more problems about debt that are going to impact the Romans going forward. And again, this also is a military problem. If you have people who are in nexum contract, they can't serve in the army if they're busy being someone's indentured servant. Nonetheless, this is a big event, and also marks the Romans for the first time transitioning from being a kind of very stagnant military state to actually showing an interest in expansion at the expense of her Italian neighbors. Now, immediately after, or almost immediately after, the capture of Veii, which is this incredible victory, the Romans suffer one of the worst defeats that they will suffer during the entire Republican period. In 390, a marauding band of Gauls confronts the Roman army, defeats it outside near the river Allia, which is a tributary of the Tiber, and then occupies the city itself. With perhaps a few soldiers still holed up on the Capitoline Hill, the citadel of the city. And supposedly the Gauls will not leave until the Romans pay them a ransom, 1,000 pounds of gold. And in the telling of the story, which again may be too good to be true, but nonetheless is a moral story that the Romans subsequently used to think about their own vulnerability and the nature of defeat, the Gauls have set up some scales so that they can measure the gold. So there's gold put on one side, weights put on the other. One of the sort of Roman quaestors, the financial official, starts complaining, saying, "I don't think those scales are fair. I think the scales are a little too heavy. We need to adjust the weights on this side to make sure we're putting down the right amount of gold." And the Gallic leader Brennus supposedly throws his sword upon the scale, which means the scale goes down and the Romans now have to add even more gold, and says, "Why victus?" which roughly translates, "Woe be to the conquered." Now, suffice to say, the Gauls do leave, but this is a humiliating and devastating defeat, particularly coming so close on what had been a major victory against Veii. There is some evidence that Rome's standing in the sort of central Italy is diminished somewhat in the immediate years after this defeat. Although Rome does bounce back. The Gauls take what they want and leave, and the Romans still have their territory. They still have Veii. They actually are settling Veii in the aftermath of this defeat, and indeed perhaps the need to try to give plots of land so that people can potentially serve as soldiers is one way that they're trying to recover from the Gallic disaster. But nonetheless, it is a really big and serious and humiliating setback. Now, that said, life goes on. The dominant form of executive authority in Rome continues to be these boards, usually now of 6 military tribunes with consular powers, aka consular tribunes. And the social strife is still there. There still is disputes over debt. And again, there is still this kind of alliance between wealthy plebeians who want more access to power and poorer plebeians who, say, are unhappy about Nexum contracts. In 367, Rome is again threatened by another potential Gallic invasion. One trend has been, starting in the probably around 5th century, Gauls moving into Cisalpine Gaul, moving down the Po River, in the whole Po River region, and then raiding across the Apennines, possibly at times not just to raid, but even looking to settle. There is another sort of potential threat in 367, and this threat may spur a major package of reforms designed to ameliorate the long-standing grievances between patricians and plebeians. And there's going to be something in there for both wealthy plebeians and poor plebeians. For poor plebeians, the primary benefit is that limits will be placed on the amount of public land that is conquered by the Romans but kept as the communal property of the Roman people and then rented out to individual Romans. It seems this public land is routinely rented out at a very cheap price by very wealthy people so that poor people can't get access to small amounts of public land to graze their animals or grow additional crops or do whatever. The law, a set of laws, like Licinian Stolian laws of 367, limit how much public land anyone can hold to 500 jugera. A jugerum, Roman unit of measure, plural jugera, is about 2/3 of an acre. So this may free up some public land for poor Romans. From a political perspective, the big settlement of 367 is it reestablishes, or maybe even establishes for the first time, the consulship as we will know it from here on out. 2 senior magistrates who have the power of imperium, that is, they're preceded by 12 lictors carrying fasces. They have the power of life and death. So there will now be 2 of them, but one of them is plebeian, although it takes a little while for the habit of one plebeian consul to stick. It's not really till after 342 that one consul is always plebeian. But at least after 367, there will be 2 consuls again every year. We never hear of military tribunes with consular powers. And one of them can be a plebeian, and eventually after 342 that shifts to will be a plebeian. And in fact, by 172, both consuls are plebeian. It's the first fully plebeian college. And so this represents a pretty major settlement in the struggle of the orders. It's not over. There are still going to be some more plebeian victories to go. But this will probably go a long way towards explaining why Roman conquest really is going to pick up after the middle of the 4th century BC. There's now plebeians who are gaining access to the highest office, the highest military office, and they have every reason to try to prove themselves as aggressive military commanders. And this also means that the patricians, who before didn't really have to prove themselves, have to up their game. And the way they do it is also by trying to prove that they can be aggressive and effective military commanders. So this really represents a big shift of Rome towards being a conquest state. Now, in addition to these 2 consuls, a new office is created, the office of praetor. And initially there's only one praetor, who will be what effectively is later called the urban praetor, the praetor urbanus. And this praetor can still command armies. It's debated. Eventually this praetor is seen as junior to the consuls. There are some historians who argue at the time he may have been seen as equal to the consuls. And in fact, the praetors until the 330s are all patrician. But praetors are responsible for home defense, commanding the armies that actually defend the area around Rome. But they also have a lot of important jurisdictions legally. If both the consuls are off campaigning, the praetor is in Rome, and therefore he's the one you're going to come to if you need a judgment. And indeed, the judicial functions of the praetors are going to be the most important functions eventually for the urban praetor, particularly as he is increasingly staying in Rome while the consuls and other praetors are going out to fight abroad. So we have 2 consuls and a praetor. That is the big important reform of 367 that really sets up the kind of what the canonical Roman magistrate system is going to look like from here on out, after a great deal of flux that had come before. Now the plebeians still have some gains that they need to make. One big gain that comes, depending on our sources, in either 326 or 313, is the banning of the nexum contract. So this contract, which allows you to basically offer yourself into indentured servitude as part of a loan, either as collateral or maybe as the payment. There's a lot about nexum we don't know. But clearly it's an onerous form, and it's abolished by the Lex Poetelia. And the story behind nexum may sound familiar if you've been listening to the civic myth that we've been talking about so far. Supposedly there is a young man who has been sold into one of these, to a nexum contract, an indentured servitude contract by his indebted father. His new master tries to sexually abuse him. He resists and is ordered flogged, and instead he runs to the Roman people seeking redress. And the Roman people are so angry that there was an attempt to sexually assault this young man that this leads to the sort of chain reaction that leads to the passage of the law and bans nexum. Now, notably, sexual assault has so far been repeatedly used as a metaphor for misgovernance when Romans think about why change happens. The rape of Lucretia, the attempt to enslave and rape Virginia, explaining why the decemvirs go. Interesting, this is the first time we really have the assault being threatened against a man rather than a woman. And interestingly, since we know that patriarchy is telling the stories, whereas the female heroines are liquidated, Lucretia kills herself, Virginia is killed by her father, this nice young man in the story gets to go home alive. But nonetheless, the Romans say, because of that, we banned nexum. That story again, probably not true, but the end of the nexum contract is a further gain, in that this sort of legal form that was probably quite advantageous to big landowners and not advantageous to more common debtors is abolished. Another big deal, in 304 BC, the Romans publish the formula, or I guess the sort of very specific formula that you need to engage in civil suits in Rome. So we've had the 12 tables published. That actually tells you what the law is. But there's a very specific set of basically set words that you need to use if you're actually going to try to gain remedy under the law. And these are called the leges actiones. And if you say the wrong word, because this is a very kind of archaic system that relies very strictly on the formula, you can have your case thrown out. So we're given an example by a later jurist that says, let's say you've had some vines that are damaged by a neighbor and you're bringing a suit against it. The right formula, if you're actually trying to use the leges actio, the proper leges actio, is you have to actually say the word trees, because that's the big category of the 12 tables that you're bringing suit. So if you are saying I'm coming to file suit about my vines, case thrown out. And if you don't know this, if you're just a simple peasant, it's very hard for you to access the law, even though those 12 tables are published. So in 304, the specific leges actiones are published so that everyone can see them and know what the exact formulas are that you need to use. And actually, as a result, that leges actio system pretty quickly goes by the wayside. And people start using a much more flexible system of law generated by the praetors. We can talk about that at a later date. But another victory again for common people trying to mobilize their rights via law. In 300, a law is passed that establishes the right of provocatio. And the Romans will come to think of provocatio as fundamental to Roman freedom. And provocatio is the right within the city of Rome, and usually 1 mile outside, the same area where the tribunes are held to have their powers of intercessio. But the right of provocatio is to, if a Roman magistrate is trying to kill you or flog you, that is, they're mobilizing the rights of imperium against you, you can appeal to an assembly of the Roman people that judgment. So the right of appeal, the Romans think about that as fundamental to Roman liberty, provocatio. There are some stories that suggest that laws about this had been passed earlier, but the law in 300, either it reestablishes it or probably quite likely establishes it altogether, the Lex Poetelia. Again, another big step in common Romans claiming a check against the arbitrary violence of the magistrates. Now, according to the Romans sort of themselves, the end of the struggle of the orders comes in 287. In that year, there is the last attested secessio of the plebs. And what they achieve is a new law, the Lex Hortensia. And what this says is that any decision made by the concilium plebis, made by that assembly that consists solely of plebeians, that's summoned by a tribune of the plebs, whatever plebiscite that assembly produces is binding on the entire community. It's not just binding on the plebs, it's binding on the whole citizen body, on patricians, on the magistrates. And what this means is that the concilium plebis, usually meeting as a kind of tribal assembly summoned by the tribunes, will be the most important legislative assembly for the Roman people. Although we will talk more about the different types of voting assemblies that the Romans have, as the same sort of people come together to vote in different configurations. Again, 287, we therefore see the kind of, again, it's oftentimes the official end of the struggle of the orders. Clearly there are still socioeconomic problems in Rome. Those never fully go away and actually flare up again when we get to the late Republic. But nonetheless, one important thing to note is that by the time we get to the 3rd century, the distinction between patricians and plebeians it's there. It's a kind of still a social distinction, but it really doesn't have the kind of true legal or political basis that it did back in the 5th and 4th century BC. I will leave you there. One thing that I will note, the Romans don't fully solve their social and economic problems, but they do come up with some real solutions to them. And those solutions don't make Rome a utopia or an equal society or a democracy by any regard, but they do make it more egalitarian and, I would dare say, somewhat more democratic. It's notable that these solutions correspond closely with Rome's rise as a militarily dominant power. I don't think that's just a coincidence. Rome needs to solve its internal problems before it can become an externally effective force. So what we'll be talking about next week are some Republican institutions, the actual structure of the Roman career path, the Roman army, Roman voting, and how the Roman Republic works once it's actually arrived at the form that we will know it from the Middle Republic. That'll be our topic for next week. Have a good weekend.